She handed out iPads and stacks of cash to every grandchild, except my daughter. Then my 7-year-old stood up, walked to the head of the table, and placed a red box in front of her. "Daddy told me to give this to you if you ever ignored me again." What happened next? It shattered every fake smile in the room and changed our family forever. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about a little girl who refused to be invisible, and what happened when love finally stood up to blood. Welcome to our channel, where real stories come to life with heart depth and meaning. Thank you for clicking on this video and spending your time with us. I invite you to stay until the very end, because today's story isn't just emotional. It might just change the way you think about love, family, and what it means to truly belong. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment. The laughter in the room was thick and syrupy, like warm honey spilled across polished wood and satin napkins. Wine glasses clinked, forks scraped fine china, and someone's holiday playlist hummed a jazzy version of Silver Bells under it all. Diane's annual Christmas brunch was in full swing. Her house glimmered in curated elegance, every detail staged as if it belonged in a magazine. Gilded garland velvet bows, a 9-foot artificial tree that touched the ceiling and sparkled like it had its own spotlight. Everything was perfect. Except for Lily. She stood at the edge of the table, small hands gripping a red box wrapped in smooth paper. Her sparkly gold dress shimmered under the chandelier, catching flecks of light like magic. Her curls were tied back in a glittery headband, the one she wore the day Mark signed her adoption papers. She had picked the dress herself, told me she wanted to look shiny like a star. Now she stood there quietly holding that box like it was something sacred, watching everyone around her act as if she didn't exist. Mark and I had seen it coming. The shift in her posture, the soft pull of her mouth, the way she didn't reach for her orange juice when it was poured into a plain cup instead of the snowman mug all the other kids had. She had barely eaten her French toast. She had said thank you when Diane handed her a lavender candle, no card, no bow, no joy, and then she went quiet. Too quiet. And that's when she stood up, on her own. She walked around the table with slow, measured steps, careful not to bump into anyone's chair. People were mid-conversation laughing about last year's ski trip or gossiping about who hadn't RSVP'd this year. But slowly, the noise began to dim as Lily reached the head of the table where Diane sat sipping her second mimosa. Without raising her voice, Lily extended the box. "Grandma," she said clear and steady, "Daddy told me to give you this if you ever ignored me again." The silence that followed wasn't the kind of silence people notice. It was the kind that grips a room by the throat. Diane froze her hand still on her glass. She blinked, smiled awkwardly like she hadn't heard correctly, and let out a light laugh, the kind that older women use to dismiss discomfort. "What's this, sweetheart?" Lily didn't answer. She just stepped back, returned to her seat beside me, and folded her hands in her lap. I felt Mark's hand slip into mine under the table. His grip was tight, calm on the outside, burning on the inside. Diane's fingers hesitated over the wrapping. The paper was simple, solid red with no bows or tags. She opened it slowly, still smiling like this was all some harmless child's prank. But when the lid came off and she looked inside, something in her eyes changed. Her face drained of color. Her lips parted as if she might say something clever, but nothing came out. Then she screamed. A sound that didn't match the room or the holiday or the woman who had always held herself like a queen on a throne. It wasn't a sob. It wasn't a gasp. It was a raw, jagged animal scream. Forks clattered against plates. Someone dropped a champagne glass. I think Madison flinched in her seat. Jonas stared Cookie mid-bite. The jazz music kept playing in the background, cheerful and absurd. Diane shoved back her chair, still staring into the box, and covered her mouth with a trembling hand. She looked around the room like she didn't recognize anyone. Then she looked at Mark. And me. And finally Lily. She opened her mouth again, but no words came out. That was when I knew this moment had been waiting for years. Not just months, not just holidays, it had been building slowly, painfully, with every exclusion, every forced smile, every forgotten invitation. And now it had cracked wide open. The room was frozen in tableau. No one moved, no one dared to speak. And then I remembered this wasn't really the beginning. This was the breaking point. The beginning was much quieter, a slow unraveling stitched together with birthday parties, school crafts, and paper plates with no names. It was shaped by polite silences and the exhausting hope that love would eventually come if we just waited long enough. And as Diane stood trembling at the head of her perfectly decorated table, holding the truth in her manicured hands, I heard my own voice in my head. Let me tell you how we got here. Because it wasn't one insult, it wasn't one candle, it was all of it. And it was finally time to stop pretending it didn't matter. Before the red box, before the candle, before the silence that tore through the room like a winter wind, there was love. Or at least the promise of it. I met Mark on an ordinary Tuesday in line at the DMV. Romantic, I know. He let me cut ahead of him because I was juggling a toddler and a diaper bag that kept slipping off my shoulder. Most people pretend not to see you when you're flustered and covered in crayon marks. But he saw me. "Go ahead," he said with a kind smile. "Looks like you've already waited long enough." I didn't know then that he would be the one to sit through every version of Lily's dance recitals, the one to install her nightlights and read her bedtime stories, and later sign the paperwork that made what was already true legally real. I just knew that he was patient and funny and warm in the way that made me feel a little less like I had to keep holding my breath all the time. We dated for 2 years before we got married. By then, Lily was almost 3 and already calling him daddy more often than not. We didn't push it. She just did it. And Mark never flinched, never hesitated. He slipped into the rhythm of our little duo like he'd always been meant to be part of it. And with Mark came his family. They were big and boisterous and rooted in tradition. Sunday dinners with pot roast and apple pie, game nights with 5 different dips, and someone always cheating at charades. A Facebook group for family announcements, prayer chains, and way too many gifts. At the center of it all was Diane, Mark's mother, the kind of woman who wore lipstick, even on grocery runs, and arranged her towels by season. She spoke with certainty about everything: how turkey should be brined, how children should behave, how families should function. At first, I admired her. Diane had a way of commanding a room, but always with a smile. She complimented my cooking at Thanksgiving. "This stuffing is surprisingly good," pulled me into side conversations, offered hugs at the door. She talked about traditions and making space for new daughters-in-law. She called me dear. She passed down a casserole recipe. I thought she likes me. I wanted her to. I grew up without a big family. Holidays were often just my mom and me and an overcooked chicken. The first time I saw Diane's house at Christmas, the lights, the fireplace, the matching flannel pajamas, it felt like I'd stepped into a snow globe. I didn't want to shake it. I wanted to stay. And so when small things started to chip at that perfect picture, I didn't say anything. It started with the group texts. Mark would mention a family potluck and I'd ask, "When did we plan that?" He'd scroll and show me the message thread. I wasn't in it. Then there were the comments, soft at first. "You're more modern than the rest of us. You didn't grow up with the same traditions, so I get it. You're raising Lily to be very independent." Always with a smile, always with a laugh, never enough to point a finger at, but just enough to sting. Once she brought monogrammed Easter baskets for all the grandkids. Lily's had a tag that said, "From Emily's side." When I mentioned it to Mark later, he furrowed his brow. "That can't be right," he said. "She knows I adopted her." He called her gently. She said it was just a mistake, a mix-up. She'd get it right next time. Next time came, and it didn't change. Still, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Diane was old-fashioned, set in her ways. Maybe she just didn't know how to love in the way I needed her to, or in the way Lily deserved. I found excuses for her. Maybe it's a generation gap. Maybe it's not personal. Maybe she doesn't realize she's doing it. And because I wanted the picture-perfect family, I smiled through it. I helped wash dishes. I complimented her pies. I asked her about her garden. I tried to belong. Because for me, it wasn't just about being liked. It was about Lily. I wanted her to have cousins to play with, a big table to sit at during holidays. I wanted her to feel rooted, seen, included, all the things I hadn't always had. But you can't plant roots in soil that won't claim you. And even though Mark had claimed us fully, completely, and without hesitation, Diane hadn't. She loved being a grandmother. But not to my daughter. And it would take me longer than I want to admit to realize that trying harder wouldn't change that. At first, it was easy to explain away. When Diane forgot to include Lily in the group photo of all the grandkids at Rachel's baby shower, I told myself it was because Lily had wandered off to pet the dog. When she brought souvenir t-shirts from her beach vacation, pink and sparkly for Madison Blue, and athletic for Jonah. Nothing for Lily. I said maybe she didn't know Lily's size. When Lily wasn't invited to the cousin's sleepover, I lied. "They're not having one this time, sweetie, just a grown-ups night." I didn't believe it. And neither did Lily, but we both pretended. It's funny how subtle exclusion can bleed into the background of everyday life. It doesn't shout, it doesn't slam doors or throw tantrums. It just closes the door softly over and over until one day you realize it never really opened for you in the first place. Birthdays were always the most obvious. For Maddie and Jonah, Diane showed up with oversized gift bags topped with ribbons, iPads, sports gear boutique dolls, art kits with their names monogrammed in gold cursive. For Lily, the gifts came in dollar store bags. A puzzle that was missing pieces. A coloring book meant for a toddler. Once a plastic doll with hair already fraying at the ends. Lily always said thank you. She always smiled. And I always felt something unravel inside me, quietly, politely. But the holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving in particular had become Diane's personal Olympics. She started planning in October, color-coded seating charts, pumpkins, centerpieces, cloth napkins folded into turkeys. She made the kids their own little table, complete with paper crafts and mini pumpkin pies. That year, Diane had outdone herself. She had handmade ceramic plates with each grandchild's name painted in gold across the rim. There was Maddie's with flowers, Jonah's with baseballs, even one for baby Chloe with pastel rattles and booties. Lily's seat had one of the spare plates from the kitchen cabinet, plain white with a small chip on the edge. I stared at it. So did Lily. No one said anything. No one seemed to notice. Diane breezed through the room in her cranberry sweater, passing out cider and snapping photos of the real grandkids, as she called them, when she thought no one else could hear. That night after dinner, as we stood in the entryway pulling on coats and wrapping scarves, Lily tugged my hand gently. "Mom." I knelt to zip her jacket. "Yeah, baby." She looked over her shoulder at the table, now cleared and quiet. "Maybe Grandma thinks I'm just visiting." My breath caught in my throat. I looked up. Mark was just behind her. He heard it. He didn't speak. But I saw it in his face, the clench in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. He reached out, placed a firm hand on Lily's shoulder, and said gently, "You're not visiting Lily. You belong." She nodded, but I could tell the words bounced off some part of her that had already started to harden. On the drive home, Lily stared out the window. The street lamps blurred against the glass as the car moved through the neighborhood. Her fingers traced little shapes in the fog of her breath on the window pane. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. Later that night, I pulled out my phone and scrolled back through old photos. I found one from 3 years earlier, Lily's 3rd birthday. Diane had given her a stuffed bunny from Walgreens and told her, "It's not much, but you'll understand when you're older." That same year, Maddie had gotten a backyard playset and a 2-tiered birthday cake with her name spelled in fondant. I had said nothing. I had smiled through it. Because I thought silence was strength. Because I thought keeping the peace was love. But I didn't realize that peace built on quiet pain eventually becomes resentment, and that little girls shouldn't have to grow up thinking invisibility is the price of belonging. The next day, I brought it up with Mark while Lily was at school. We sat at the kitchen table, the chipped Thanksgiving plate still on the counter where I had unpacked it by accident. He ran a hand through his hair and said, I didn't think it would get this bad. It's always been this bad, I said softly. We just didn't want to see it. He nodded slow and heavy. Then he stood up, took the plate, and dropped it into the trash can without a word. It shattered softly against the plastic bottom. I see it now, he said. And I won't let her feel like that again. It was a promise, and I would soon find out that he meant every word. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that silence was strength. I told myself that if I could just absorb the awkwardness, the exclusion, the little slights that curled like smoke around family dinners and holiday brunches, I could preserve something bigger, something that mattered more than my discomfort, something Lily needed more than I needed to be right. I told myself I was protecting her. Family unity. That was the phrase I clung to, like a banner I'd carry into every gathering, my smile pinned in place like armor. When Mark asked me if I was okay after Lily received a broken toy at Maddie's birthday party, I lied. It's fine, I said. She's little. She doesn't notice. But she did. She always did. Lily wasn't the kind of child who made scenes. She didn't whine or cry when she was treated differently. She just got quieter, smaller. She sat closer to me. She played alone. And every time Diane handed out matching pajamas, and Lily got a single fleece blanket in a different pattern, she folded it in her lap and said, "Thanks," in a voice so small I wanted to scream for her. But I didn't. Because if I made noise, I'd be the one tearing the fabric. Not Diane. Not the people who made her feel like a guest in her own family. Me. So I learned to nod politely. I brought extra cookies to parties. I complimented Diane's home decor. I laughed when she called Lily your little one instead of our granddaughter. I took pictures of all the grandkids and captioned them with neutral terms like cousin crew and holiday memories, even when I knew my daughter had spent most of the afternoon watching from the sidelines. At home, Mark and I started fighting in whispers. It always happened after Lily was asleep. I'd wait until her door was closed, until her breathing evened out into soft hums. Then I'd sit across from him on the couch and ask, "Did you see it?" He'd nod. He always saw it. "I don't know what to do," he said one night, rubbing his temples. "It's my mom. She's always been like this. I thought she'd come around." I looked at him. "And if she doesn't?" Mark's silence was loud. "I'm not asking you to cut her off," I said, my voice thin. "I'm asking you to protect Lily." "I am," he replied. "But I don't want to turn this into a war. It's already a war," I said. "We just keep pretending it's a holiday." We both fell quiet. There were no easy answers. Diane wasn't cruel in obvious ways. She didn't say hateful things. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't push Lily aside with her hands, only with her absence. She smiled while doing it. That was the worst part, because it made me feel crazy for noticing, for feeling it, for hurting on my daughter's behalf. And in trying so hard not to be too sensitive, I was teaching Lily that silence was how you stayed in the room, that being treated as less was something you had to earn your way out of, that love was a prize, and she just hadn't won it yet. One night Lily came home from a family barbecue holding a balloon animal. "She made this one for Maddie," she said, holding up the slightly lopsided dog. But I asked if I could keep it since I didn't get one. I asked her if she had fun. She nodded. I played with the dog for a while. The real one, not the balloon. She liked me. Then she climbed onto the couch, curled up next to me, and whispered, "Mom, do you think it's okay if people don't like you right away?" My chest ached. "Yes," I said slowly. "It is. But you don't have to stay where you're not wanted." Lily thought about that for a moment. Even if they're family, I didn't have an answer. Because I didn't know what was worse, being rejected by strangers or by people who claimed to love you. That night after she went to bed, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and stared at myself. My reflection looked tired, older than 34. I thought about the women in Mark's family, perfectly put together, big pearl earrings, casseroles that won ribbons. I thought about the time Diane joked that I was spirited and a little intense. I thought about the fact that she'd never asked what Lily's favorite color was. And I thought about how hard I'd worked to fold myself into a shape that would fit into Diane's life. A shape that didn't take up too much space, that didn't ask for too much love. I wiped off my mascara and said aloud, "Enough." But I didn't say it to Diane. Not yet. Because even as I felt the cracks forming, part of me still hoped. Still believed that maybe next Christmas would be different. Maybe the next invitation would come with Lily's name spelled right. Maybe Diane would look at her and see the child who had already lost enough and decide that love didn't need matching DNA to be real. So I kept quiet. I kept showing up. And Lily kept learning. That love sometimes looked like being left out. That kindness sometimes came wrapped in fake smiles. That family could sometimes feel more like a test you never passed. And while I waited for Diane to change, something else was changing. Not around Lily, but inside her. It happened on a Saturday in early October, the kind of crisp autumn day when the air smells like cinnamon and dried leaves and every kid's nose is just a little pink from the breeze. We were at Jonah's birthday party. The backyard had been transformed into a pirate ship adventure, complete with plastic swords, treasure maps, and gold-foiled chocolate coins scattered through the bushes. Diane had, of course, planned the whole thing down to the nautical cupcake toppers and the personalized gift bags. There was one for every child, every grandchild, with their names printed in bold pirate font. Maddie's was pink with glitter. Jonah's was stuffed full of Pokemon cards, a toy compass, and a pirate hat. Lily's was an afterthought. No name, just a plain white bag with a pack of stickers and a single roll of Smarties. She smiled anyway, told me she liked the stickers. I bit the inside of my cheek and nodded. When it came time for cake, Diane gathered all the kids around the picnic table. The cake was a towering pirate ship made of chocolate and fondant, with miniature flags, and even a plastic cannon on deck. The candles were lit, all 10 of them, and everyone sang in unison while Jonah beamed at the center of it all. After the song, Diane began cutting generous slices. She handed the first one to Maddie, thick with frosting, and topped with one of the decorative flags. Jonah got the next, the biggest piece complete with the fondant anchor. The other kids followed. Then she came to Lily. "Here you go, sweetheart," Diane said, placing a narrow slice on a paper plate. It was the end piece, dry, slightly crumbling, no frosting, no candle, no decoration, just plain cake and a plastic fork. Lily took it carefully. She smiled and said, "Thank you," her voice soft. She didn't look for more, didn't ask for anything else. Mark saw it. He was across the yard at the time talking with his brother near the grill. But he saw it. I watched his expression shift as Lily walked back to us holding her plate like it might fall apart. His smile faded. His posture straightened. His hands slowly slid into his pockets like he was grounding himself. He didn't say anything for the rest of the party. He helped clean up. He thanked Diane. He nodded along with the jokes and stories. But there was something simmering under the surface, not rage, not impulse, but a deep, deliberate calculation. That night, after Lily was asleep, he didn't come straight to bed. I found him at the dining room table, the soft light of his laptop casting a glow over his face. His jaw was tense, eyes focused, the printer whirring beside him. "What are you doing?" I asked. Mark didn't look up. "Finishing something I should have done a long time ago." I stepped closer and saw the pages sliding into the tray, Lily's adoption papers, a fresh notarized copy. On the table sat a small photo Mark and Lily from years ago, the day the judge finalized it. She was in pigtails, chocolate frosting on her cheeks, hugging his neck like she never planned to let go. He was smiling in that quiet way he always did when he was most proud. He opened a drawer and pulled out a red box. It had once held a watch I'd given him years ago. Now it held something heavier. He slid the photo and the papers inside. Then he picked up a pen and began to write. I didn't ask what the letter said. I watched him write slowly, deliberately, the way he did when words mattered most. When he finished, he folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it in the box. He stared at it for a moment, like he was memorizing its weight. Then he stood up and went to Lily's room. She stirred slightly when he kissed her forehead, blinking sleepy eyes. "Hey, little bird," he whispered. "I have something for you." She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Is it a bedtime story?" "Sort of," he said with a small smile. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed and placed the box in her lap. Her fingers traced the edges of the lid. "Can I open it now?" "You can," he said gently, "but you don't have to." She looked up, confused. He continued, "This is something special. Inside is proof of something you already know, that you are my daughter. Forever and always. No one can take that away. Not ever." She nodded slowly. "And there's also a letter," he added, "just in case someone ever makes you feel like you're not part of this family. If that ever happens again, this box is yours to give." Lily looked down at the box. She didn't open it. She didn't ask questions. She just hugged it to her chest and whispered, "Okay, Daddy." He kissed her again, then tucked her back under the covers. When he came back to the living room, I didn't ask what the letter said. I didn't need to. I just wrapped my arms around him and whispered, "Thank you," because for the first time he hadn't tried to fix it quietly. He had handed our daughter the power to say enough. Diane's house looked like it had been lifted straight out of a holiday magazine. Every garland was perfectly fluffed. The tree stood tall and regal in the corner of the living room, decked with gold ribbon spirals and carefully spaced crystal ornaments. Even the cookies on the tray matched the napkins. Her home glowed with candlelight and a carefully curated scent, cinnamon pine, and just a whisper of something sweet, like vanilla. It should have felt magical. Instead, it felt like walking into a stage set. Every surface shined, every word rehearsed. As we stepped inside, I felt the air change. The warmth was artificial, like everything was on display, but nothing was meant to be touched. Lily walked beside me, holding the gift she'd made for Diane at school, a hand-painted wooden trinket box with tiny rhinestones and Grandma written in glittery, crooked letters. She wore the gold dress she'd picked out weeks before, the one she said made her feel like a star. She stood just a little taller as we entered, hopeful. Diane greeted Madison with a loud, dramatic hug. "My little star." She beamed, holding her close. Jonah got a high five and, "Look at you taller every time I see you." Then Diane turned to Lily. "Hi, sweetie. You look festive." No hug, no warmth. Her eyes flicked briefly over the gift in Lily's hands. Lily extended it gently. "I made this for you." Diane took it with one hand, glanced at it like it was a napkin someone had handed her by mistake, and set it down on the side table without a second glance. The sound it made hitting the table, that soft clunk, echoed louder in my chest than it should have. Lily didn't say anything. She just walked over to the couch and sat next to Madison, folding her hands in her lap. The day went on. Wine was poured, laughter flowed. Someone turned on a holiday playlist. I watched from the edge of it all, barely tasting the cider in my cup. Every year I told myself this might be the one that changed. That maybe Diane would soften. Maybe she would see the way Lily's face lit up when she talked about her cousins, how carefully she picked out gifts for them. Maybe she'd notice how badly my daughter wanted to belong. But this year wasn't different. This year, the difference was me. I wasn't hoping anymore. I was watching. And I was starting to reach a quiet edge I didn't know I had. After dinner, we all gathered near the tree for Diane's gift circle. She always handed them out one by one, like she was orchestrating a pageant. She made a show of every name, every ribbon, every reaction. Jonah was first. He opened a thick envelope with his name in bold cursive. His eyes lit up. Money. Everyone clapped. Madison went next, a brand new iPad, wrapped in shimmering paper and tied with a silver bow. Diane beamed as she opened it. "You're so generous," Mom Mark's sister gushed. Diane waved her hand like it was nothing. "They're good kids. They deserve it." Then she turned and picked up a small bag with pink tissue paper. "This is for you, sweetheart," she said, holding it out to Lily. "Didn't want you to feel completely left out." The room quieted slightly. Everyone was watching now. Lily stood, walked over and took the bag with both hands. She peeked inside. It was a candle. Lavender. In a plain glass jar. No sparkle, no ribbon, no card. Just a tag that read, "To Mark's girl." That was it. Lily blinked once, her expression unreadable. She nodded softly and returned to her seat. She didn't cry, she didn't frown. But I saw her go still. It wasn't loud the way kids normally express disappointment. It wasn't even obvious. But I saw it. The way her shoulders settled just slightly. The way she folded her hands over the candle in her lap and stared at the base of the tree. It was the kind of stillness that lives in children who've learned not to expect too much. The kind that taught me all at once that this wasn't just another missed moment. This was a lesson, a message, a seed being planted in my daughter's heart, telling her that even here, even in her own family, she was something other. I looked at Mark. He was staring at the floor, fingers laced tightly, jaw clenched. He didn't speak, but I saw it in his eyes he hadn't forgotten. Not the box, not the promise. I turned to Lily and rested my hand gently on her back. She looked up at me, her eyes calm but distant. "I'm okay, Mama," she whispered. Really. But I wasn't. Because I could feel it, the slow, silent breaking of the part of me that had worked so hard to keep the peace. The part of me that said, just let it go. The part of me that tried to convince us both that love didn't need to look fair to be real. That part of me was dying. And in its place, something else was rising. Something that sounded a lot like, no more. The drive home that night was quiet. The kind of quiet where everyone is thinking something they're not quite ready to say. Christmas lights blurred past the windows, little bursts of color against the black sky. Lily sat in the back seat, still in her gold dress, the lavender candle resting in her lap. She didn't look sad. She didn't look angry. She just looked still. At a red light, I turned in my seat to look at her. "Hey, baby, are you okay?" Before she could answer, Mark spoke gently, his voice low and sure. "She's not mad at you, sweetheart," he said, his eyes catching Lily's in the rearview mirror. "Grandma just forgot something important." Lily nodded slowly, eyes steady. "Then I want to give her the box tomorrow." I blinked. "What?" I asked, thinking I must have misheard her. She looked up, voice even calm. "I want to give her the box. At brunch." Mark glanced at me. I turned back to Lily. "You sure?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from trembling. She nodded again. "Daddy said I could when it was time." There was no defiance in her voice, no drama, just a simple decision made with the kind of clarity most adults never manage to find. I stared at her for a moment longer. She didn't flinch. That was when I felt it, the shift, the power moving from reaction to intention. My daughter wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't hoping for attention. She wasn't trying to make a scene. She was claiming her space, and she had already decided how to do it. When we got home, Mark carried in the leftover cookies, and I helped Lily out of the car. She still held the candle in the box like they were two parts of the same story. She walked inside on her own, calm and composed, and set both items on her desk before heading to her room. I stood in the hallway watching her. She turned to me. "Can you help with my hair tomorrow?" "Of course," I said. "I want to wear the gold dress again," she added, "and the sparkly headband." "Sounds perfect," I replied. She nodded once and closed her door behind her. In our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at my hands. They were shaking slightly. "She's really doing it," I said softly. Mark sat beside me. "She's ready." I turned to him. "What exactly did you write in that letter?" He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Enough." And that was all I needed to know. The next morning, Lily woke up before either of us. She had already laid out her dress and shoes and was brushing her hair when I walked in. She turned and smiled. "Can we curl it like last time?" she asked. I nodded, reaching for the curling iron. "Of course we can." She sat quietly while I worked, not fidgeting, not distracted, focused. When we were done, she placed the glittery headband over her curls and turned to face me fully. "Do you think she'll get it?" she asked. I don't know, I answered honestly, but I think it's enough that you're giving her the chance. Lily smiled again, small and steady, and picked up the red box. She held it in both hands like something sacred, like truth. At brunch, Diane's house looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Same wreath, same garland, same scent of cinnamon and pine, but everything felt different, at least to us. We walked in together, Mark's hand at Lily's back, my heart pounding in time with every step. Diane greeted us with the same polished warmth she always offered a hug for Mark. A glance at me, a distracted smile for Lily. You wore the same dress? She said. Voice clipped. Didn't want to put on something new. Lily didn't answer. She walked straight to the dining room table and placed the red box directly in front of Diane's seat. The room wasn't quiet yet. People were still pouring mimosas, grabbing fruit, chatting about sales and travel plans. But Lily didn't wait. She stood at the head of the table, all of 7 years old, and said clearly, Daddy told me to give this to you if you ever ignored me again. Just like that. No drama, no raised voice. Just a quiet, sharp truth that sliced through the chatter like a bell. The room went still. Diane froze. Everyone stared. Lily stepped back, walked calmly to her seat, and sat down. She didn't reach for her juice. She didn't look around. She waited. I felt Mark's hand slip into mine under the table, his grip strong and unwavering. The box sat unopened for a moment that felt like forever. And then Diane reached for it. The next morning felt nothing like the ones before it. The sky was soft and gray, the kind of winter light that filtered through the curtains like a whispered warning. But in our house there was a stillness that wasn't fear. It was readiness. Mark wore his usual calm. I could see the tension in his shoulders, but his voice was steady. He brewed the coffee. He helped Lily smooth her gold dress. He kissed my cheek before we left like it was just another Sunday. But we both knew it wasn't. This wasn't just brunch. This was a reckoning wrapped in quiet politeness and wrapped gifts. Lily sat in the back seat again, the red box in her lap. Her curls were perfect. Her glitter headband shimmered in the winter light. She looked like a little girl going to a party, but carried herself like someone who had already lived through something bigger. When we pulled into Diane's driveway, nothing had changed. The same wreath hung on the door. The same careful hedges framed the path. Inside, the same holiday music played softly through the speakers. But we were different now. As soon as we stepped in, Diane greeted Madison with her usual enthusiasm. My beautiful girl! Look at that dress. You always look like you stepped out of a catalog. She kissed Maddie on the cheek once, then again, then once more for good measure. Jonah got a back pat and a hey champ. Ready for some bacon? Then she turned to Lily. You again, she said, with a tone that hovered between amusement and disinterest. Wearing gold again? You really like that color, huh? She didn't wait for an answer. She just turned and headed toward the kitchen, calling over her shoulder about how the strata was almost ready. Lily didn't flinch. She held the box a little tighter, then walked toward the table and sat quietly beside Mark. I took the seat on her other side, watching, listening. The hum of forced conversation floated around the table, weather school holiday traffic. But I wasn't really hearing any of it. I was watching my daughter. She didn't interrupt. She didn't try to wedge herself into conversations that didn't include her. She just waited. She waited while Diane told the story of Madison's choir recital again. She waited while Jonah unwrapped a belated Christmas gift again. She waited while Diane complimented Maddie's hair again. She waited silent and still until dessert, the clink of forks, the shift of chairs. Someone poured more coffee. Someone else passed the whipped cream. And that's when Lily stood up. It was so quiet, I didn't even notice at first. But Mark did. His eyes followed her as she rose from her seat holding the red box with both hands. She walked to the head of the table to Diane's place, where she sat with her wine glass and smug comfort. Lily placed the box in front of her. Then she looked directly at her grandmother and said in a voice as clear and soft as glass, Daddy said to give this to you if you ever ignored me again. Everything stopped. The forks mid-air, the wine mid-sip, the sentences mid-breath. Even the music seemed to pull back. Diane blinked, confused. Then she gave a tight smile, the kind adults use when they think a child has misunderstood the moment. "What's this, sweetie?" But Lily didn't respond. She just stepped back and returned to her seat. I felt Mark's hand find mine beneath the table. No one else moved. No one else spoke. All eyes turned to Diane, who now stared at the box as if it might detonate. She picked it up slowly, turning it over in her hands like she didn't recognize it. Then carefully, she peeled back the red wrapping paper. Her smile faded. What she saw first was the photo, a framed picture of Mark holding Lily on the day of her adoption. His eyes shining with pride, her arms around his neck, frosting still on her cheeks. A gold-foiled caption read, "Day One Dad." Beneath the photo, an envelope. She hesitated, then opened it. The pages trembled in her hands. Her eyes moved across the words. Her face shifted, pale, then hard, then uncertain. She didn't read it aloud, but we knew what it said. It was a truth she had long refused to acknowledge, a truth sealed in law and love and deliberate choice. And it had arrived from the smallest, quietest voice in the room. Her voice. Lily. She hadn't cried. She hadn't shouted. She had simply acted. And for the first time, Diane had no script to respond with. Diane stared at the red box as if it had betrayed her. For a moment, she didn't move. Her fingers hesitated over the paper, her eyes darting across the note Lily had spoken aloud. "Daddy told me to give this to you if you ever ignored me again." She let out a short, brittle laugh. "Oh, come on," she said lightly, glancing around the table for backup. "What's this? Some kind of prank?" No one responded. Mark sat stone still beside Lily, his jaw tight, his eyes unwavering. I watched him reach for our daughter's hand under the table and squeeze it gently. Diane's fingers tore through the last of the wrapping paper. When the lid came off, her expression changed immediately. At the top of the box was a framed photo, a glossy 5x7, soft lit, and beautiful. It showed Mark 5 years younger, in a worn gray button-up, seated in a hospital chair. A toddler Lily was in his lap, arms thrown around his neck, cake smeared across her cheek, eyes squinted in a toothy grin. His hand cradled her back like she was made of gold. At the bottom of the frame, written in gold foil, were the words, "Day One Dad." Diane's smile twitched. She looked up at Mark, confused now. "What is this?" But he didn't answer. She set the photo aside, slower now, and reached for the next item in the box. The legal documents. I could see her eyes catch on the words, "Adoption Certificate." Her gaze traveled line by line until it landed on Mark's name, listed as father. And Lily's name changed officially to match ours. Then came the letter. It was folded cleanly, in thirds, sealed in an envelope marked simply, "Mom." Her fingers shook slightly as she opened it. She began to read. Her face fell almost immediately. As her eyes moved across the page, her shoulders sank. Her cheeks paled, and the confident tension she usually carried like a weapon slipped away. She blinked, then blinked again. Her lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. Finally, her voice cracked. "I can't believe you'd do this to me." "Here, in front of everyone." Mark didn't look away. "I didn't do anything to you. You humiliated me." "No," he said calmly, his voice quiet but unshakable. "You did this to yourself." Diane stared at him, stunned. "After everything I've done for this family?" "This isn't about what you've done," Mark interrupted. "It's about what you refused to do." She narrowed her eyes. "This is because of her," she snapped, nodding toward me. "She turned you against your own mother." I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. Because I wasn't the one who needed defending. But Mark sat, straighter voice, colder now. "This isn't about Emily. This is about Lily. About your granddaughter. My daughter. She's not," Diane began. "She is," Mark cut in louder now. "She is mine, by law, by love. by every choice I have made since the day I met her." Silence filled the room. Even the kids had gone still. Across the table, Mark's sister looked away. Madison sat frozen mouth slightly open. Jonah's fork hovered midair. Mark's voice dropped again, low, even final. "If you don't see her as your granddaughter, then you don't see me as your son." Diane's mouth opened, but nothing came out. She looked around the room, hoping for someone to jump in to defend her, to tell her this wasn't real, that this wasn't happening. But no one spoke. The only sound in the room was the soft clink of Lily's spoon tapping the edge of her plate. Diane's hands trembled as she folded the letter back up. She placed it in the box and pushed it away like it burned. Then suddenly, her whole body stiffened. She stood up so abruptly, her chair screeched across the floor. "This is absurd," she muttered, voice rising. "You embarrassed me, both of you, in front of my family in my home." Mark stood too. He wasn't angry. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood tall, steady, like a man who'd been holding a truth for too long, and finally set it down. "This stopped being your home," he said, "the day you made my daughter feel like a stranger in it." Diane stared at him. Her face flushed with rage, her mouth twitching in disbelief. Then she turned to Lily, still seated, still calm, still holding Mark's hand. For a split second, Diane looked at her. Really looked. But whatever emotion flickered behind her eyes disappeared quickly. She picked up her wine glass, knocked back the last sip, and walked out of the room. No one followed. No one said goodbye. We gathered our coats slowly. I wrapped Lily's scarf gently around her neck. Mark picked up the box, closed it carefully, and tucked it under his arm. As we stepped outside into the winter air, Lily looked up at him and asked, "Do you think she read the whole thing?" Mark looked down and smiled, not with triumph, but with clarity. Every word he said. We didn't slam the door. We didn't shout or curse or cry. We just left. Coats on. Box under Mark's arm. Lily's glittery headband catching the light as she stepped out into the cold. There were no protests behind us, no footsteps racing to stop us at the threshold. Just silence. And that silence, oddly enough, was a gift. It told us everything we needed to know. In the car, Lily sat quietly in the back seat. She held the candle Diane had given her, cradled in her lap, like something she wasn't sure she needed anymore. Mark started the engine, but didn't drive off immediately. The three of us just sat there in the driveway, breathing the same breath, blinking away everything we'd just witnessed. Finally, Lily spoke. "Do you think she read the whole letter?" Mark met her eyes in the rearview mirror. His voice was steady. Certain. Every word. Lily nodded once, then leaned her head against the window and closed her eyes. We didn't speak again until we got home. That night, she went to bed without a fuss. She asked for 2 stories instead of 3. She tucked the sparkly headband into her drawer and whispered, "I don't think I need to wear this for people to see me anymore." And for the first time in a long time, she slept straight through the night. The next few days were quiet, brighter in a strange way. The air in our house felt lighter, like a window had finally been opened in a room we didn't realize had gone stale. Mark and I moved slower. We weren't walking on eggshells or decoding family group texts, because there weren't any. No more texts. No more updates about brunches or baby showers or distant relatives we never met. No explanations, no apologies, no last-ditch efforts at reconciliation, just silence. And peace. It took a few days to realize how much noise we'd grown used to the emotional static of trying to belong somewhere that didn't want all of us. Once it was gone, we could finally hear each other again. A week later, a padded envelope arrived in the mail addressed to Lily. She opened it slowly, curious. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a tiny heart charm and a folded note in sparkly gel pen. It said, "You're my cousin forever. I picked this with my own allowance. I'm sorry Grandma was mean. Love, Maddie." Lily smiled, not a performative smile, not a hopeful one, a real one, quiet, whole. She didn't ask if she could wear it every day. She just slipped it onto her wrist and went back to coloring. That single act, that little bracelet, did more for her than 100 family dinners ever had, because it wasn't about the money or the gift. It was about someone seeing her, choosing her, claiming her as their own. The kind of belonging that isn't handed out at holidays or earned through good behavior. The kind that lives in action, in intention, in love. And as for me, I finally exhaled. I realized I'd spent years waiting for permission. To speak, to push back, to be heard. I twisted myself into versions of polite and understanding just to keep the peace, only to learn that peace built on silence is just performance in prettier wrapping. What happened at that brunch wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about theatrics. It was about truth. It was about Lily taking up space in a room that had always treated her like a guest. It was about her saying, "I belong here, even if you refuse to see it." And it was about us, her parents, finally showing her that love doesn't whisper maybe next year. It shows up, it speaks up, it stands up. I kept the red box. It's tucked in the back of my closet now, next to her first baby shoes and the glitter crown she wore on her 3rd birthday. Not because I want to remember the pain, but because I never want to forget the strength. The strength it took for a little girl to hold the truth in her hands and offer it calmly, lovingly to someone who refused to make room for it. The strength of a man who handed that truth to her in the first place. And the strength it took for me to finally stop asking for approval that was never going to come. People think healing looks like closure. A neat bow, a hug at the end, a heartfelt apology. But sometimes healing looks like walking away. Sometimes it looks like your daughter sleeping peacefully because for once, no one made her feel like a second-tier human at her own family table. Sometimes it looks like a note from a cousin saying, "I see you. I choose you." Sometimes healing is quiet, uneventful. But always, always it is brave. And as for family, family is not who throws the biggest party or gives the shiniest gifts. It's who shows up when it's uncomfortable. It's who holds your hand at the table and says, "You belong and I'm not letting go." Lily has that now, and because of her, so do we.